After a 2-year bipartisan effort, the American Bar Association, the ABA's Task Force for American Democracy, produced this incredible report a couple of days ago. It covers 12 core areas running the gamut from civics education, redistricting, combating disinformation, to the role of lawyers. Pretty much sounds like it's everything that deals with American democracy and the rule of law. But putting aside how incredible it was to be able to get former judges and lawyers and politicians and business people and historians and scholars together to be able to volunteer their time to do this work, there were listening tours across the country. There were conversations that were had to determine, why are we at this inflection point? Why are we finding that American democracy, for some of us, feels like it's on life support? Former Homeland Security Secretary Jeh Johnson sat down with me and lent his insight and his wisdom about how we are tackling these problems and how this report gives recommendations and solutions to be able to move forward. And joining me now is the former Secretary of Homeland Security, former General Counsel of the Department of Defense, former United States Attorney, Assistant United States Attorney, and also private practice practitioner, Jeh Johnson. Secretary Johnson, it's a privilege to have you here today. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks, Katie. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your interest in our ABA Task Force report.
We are finding ourselves, sir, at an incredible inflection point in American democracy. This task force report was a labor of love. It took 2 years and a bipartisan effort to be able to create it, to ultimately come to some recommendations in 12 core areas. But before we get into those recommendations, which I think are critical to share with our viewers here, I wanted to ask you, who was a part of this essential task force, and why was there the need or the perceived need to be able to pursue this task force?
Former Judge Michael Luttig, one of my heroes, a modern day profile in courage, and I were asked to co-chair this task force by the then ABA President Mary Smith 2 years ago. Because I have so much respect for Judge Luttig, I said yes immediately. And the task was to assemble a group of Americans to be part of this task force and to study how to strengthen, salvage our democracy. We assembled a really, really impressive group of Americans, not just lawyers, historians, political scientists, authors, former judges, lawyers, of course. We had, for example, the former Chief Justice of the state of Ohio, Maureen O'Connor, Richard Haass, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Ken Chenault, Ken Frazier, retired corporate CEOs, election law experts like Rick Pildes, attorneys like Lewis Powell III from Virginia, a retired 3-star admiral. It was a really, really impressive group. Also, people like Bill Kristol, conservative Republican. And we wanted to, our original assignment was 1 year, from August 23 to August 24. We wanted to study what are the undercurrents of our society that are driving the electorate to choose not once, but twice, now twice, 2 years ago once, a president and administration that is extreme in its approach to governing. And to do that, we wanted to avoid trying to respond to the latest crisis of the week or the month or the day, which was difficult to do. The original assignment, as I said, was 1 year. We were writing the report, finishing the report in July of 24. But that was in the midst of a very, very volatile political climate. You had the attempted assassinations on former President Trump, then former President Trump, President Biden dropping out, Kamala Harris stepping in as the Democratic nominee. And we said, wait, pause. We can't write a report like this in the midst of such a volatile election season. So we suspended the effort for 1 year and came back to it this past summer. And what we really tried to do here was to put forth a series of recommendations that are enduring, long-term in nature, that would be as relevant a year from now, 2 years from now, or 4 years from now, no matter who's president, as they are today. And you therefore have this 98-page report that was just issued a few days ago.
I want to underscore something, Secretary Johnson. This is a bipartisan effort. In other words, and you reeled off a list of incredibly impressive people that are not only credentialed, but they have the training and experience to be able to speak about these important topics. But this wasn't just a one-sided view of things. In fact, you all, as a part of your methodology to prepare this report, you also did listening sessions across the United States. Talk a little bit about what those kind of entailed.
Yes, thank you for asking me about that. Our effort was not just writing this long report. We went on a listening tour around the country: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, for example, Georgia. And we were very happy to find that there were a number of similar organizations at the state and local level, all concerned about the future of our democracy. We'd go into a law school classroom or an auditorium, and it would be filled with people. How can I help? What can I do? I'm very worried about the future of our democracy. And out of that came a lot of the ideas that you see in this report. For me, one of my more memorable moments on this listening tour was encountering local election law officials at the county level in pre-election. Were very, very dedicated to a fair and impartial election, and on a nonpartisan basis. In the face of a lot of abuse, physical threats, we were elated to find people who were really dedicated to making our democracy work at the local level.
So there are 12 core areas that I mentioned a few minutes ago. I'm going to tick them off, and then I'm going to exercise interviewer's privilege to focus on a couple of them. But I urge everybody to read this report. It is, and it's an easy read. I mean, it's a compliment to you guys in the ways that you prepared it. It is not, you don't have to be a lawyer to be able to read it, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? You're able to digest this. The 12 core areas are civics education, redistricting, election processes, election administration, election worker safety, voting access, election security, combating disinformation, role of lawyers, frivolous litigation, law school training, and civil discourse. I mean, you pretty much cover the waterfront, sir, in this report. But I wanted to, again, exercise a little bit of a privilege and focus on a couple of things. I guess the one that's probably in our face, let's focus on the last one, Secretary Johnson, civil discourse. You spoke about attempted assassination attempts on Donald Trump. We do know successful assassinations that occurred with a Minnesota lawmaker, her husband, this past spring, just a few months ago, and just a few days ago, we saw the assassination of Charlie Kirk, a very well-known far-right conservative activist and commentator. Your civil discourse notes in this task force report said to promote an initiative like Disagree Better, to model respectful debate, and to reduce polarization. Yeah. Let's speak frankly about how realistic you think that's going to be, considering how incredibly toxic the climate seems to be right now.
So, two things. One, I've written a number of reports like this, both in government and out, and I have learned that 95% of the people who read these reports only read the introduction. So be comprehensive in the introduction. Sounds like you read the whole thing. Thank you. So the Disagree Better section of the report was really spearheaded by former federal appellate judge Thomas Griffith. He's a Republican appointee on the D.C. Circuit. I know you know how important the D.C. Circuit is.
Yes, sir.
And he has really been a leader in the Disagree Better effort, which very much resonates with me from my time in government. In my view, Disagree Better means the following. You walk into a room with someone you don't know, but you know their politics are very different from yours. And you're probably going to have a difficult conversation to try to reach agreement or common ground. My approach has always been assume the best in that person, and find common ground before you have to plow into the more difficult discussion. So I would meet a Republican House member, for example. Where are you from? How's your family? Where'd your kids go to school? What are your interests? What drove you to public service? And in that discourse, we're very likely to find that we have something in common, like, you know, a son who wears the uniform of our nation, or we might have gone to school in the same region of the country, or we played the same sport when we were growing up, ran the same time in the 220-yard race. I don't know. And so then when you get to the difficult discussion about, for example, um, uh, gays in the military, an issue I tackled in 2010,
Mm.
it makes it a little easier to disagree in a more respectable way. And the person that I've been in that discussion with walks away with, well, I didn't agree with everything he said, but I knew I was dealing with someone in good faith, and it enabled me to listen and discover that there are some things we do have in common. I've always thought that it's actually a mistake in the House of Representatives to have Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other. Make them all sit together. Make them all enter the room from the same doorway, so that your differences are not defined from the moment you sit down in the room. So I always, my staff, when I was Secretary of DHS and when I was at the Department of Defense, I used to drive them crazy on the Hill because I would do these drive-bys in House office buildings. I'd see a member's office, might have been a member from New York, where I grew up, might be a Republican. I'd walk in and say hello to the intern at the front desk. Hi, just want to let the member know that Jeh Johnson, Secretary of DHS, stopped by to say hello. That word always gets back to the member who remembers it. And or you walk in and the member is with his or her constituents, and all of a sudden the member gets a visit from a cabinet member, makes him look good in front of his constituents. So I'm always looking for ways to find common ground up front so that when you do disagree, you disagree better.
So I have a follow-up question for you, Secretary Johnson, and I say this from a place of respect. Do you really believe, though, that that environment about which you speak still exists? Because the fish rots from the head down, and the tone is set from the head down. And I feel like we're in a second Trump administration where, you know, these are fantastic areas to achieve reform and to pursue reform. But that environment you speak of, my fear is that that doesn't exist. The individual mentality or the individual critical thinking of certain Republicans, for example, they're taking directives from the top down. And so this idea of being able to work even in this disagree better model is a lot less feasible because of kind of the messaging and kind of the directives that they're getting at this point.
Well, I have to agree with that. But some of us have to start somewhere, or some of
Yes.
us have to continue to preach this. Otherwise, we're never, it's never going to get any better. And I do believe that there is, even though I've been out of Washington now 8.5 years, I do believe that there still is, at certain levels of political discourse and government, just below the surface of what you and I see, where there's a fair amount of goodwill, ability to work together, like congressional staffs, for example, the professional staff that's been there for years, that do the markups of appropriations bills or authorization bills, for example. Just yesterday, literally just yesterday, I had a visit in Manhattan from a person who I consider a very, very close friend now, who was a Republican House staff member when I was general counsel of DOD. And we've had this enduring friendship for the last 15 years. And it's those kinds of relationships that get stuff done in Washington and that the people count on to get done in Washington. So I agree that the discourse now, the the vehement rancor that exists now, is probably worse than it was when I was in Washington. But many of us have to continue to preach this. Otherwise, where are we?
No, I don't disagree. And I'm not suggesting otherwise. I just think we have our work cut out for us, considering where our starting point is. Another area that I did mention, one of the core areas of this task force report from the ABA, was the role of lawyers. That is something that is obviously near and dear to my heart. Having been a trial lawyer for more than 25 years, you have been a lawyer for even longer in government practice and private practice. One thing that I noted from the report that I wanted to share with our viewers was that the task force believes that lawyers have been part of the problem and must be part of the solution, as you all note. Every American lawyer takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution. By that oath, every American lawyer is an officer of the court who undertakes a personal obligation to promote justice and uphold the law. Lawyers, therefore, have the unique skills to defend democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law. Can I get an amen? I agree with that. But I think you and I are actually having to hang our heads sometimes in embarrassment when we see some of the legal wrangling that is going on. Talk a little bit about why it's so important then to start at the basics, which is not only the return to civics and then education in civics, which is another core area, and that's something that I preach so much here, but also how it involves our law schools and how we're teaching our young lawyers, because there is a lot of big question marks about the integrity of the legal profession now, considering everything that's happened from the false allegations of election fraud in 2020. And now, even now, where lawyers are being, held to task by federal judges for representations that they're making in court.
So first, it's important to remember that when we think of lawyers in America, we're not just large law firm partners and associates. We're not just prosecutors, criminal defense attorneys that show up in court every day. We're not just government attorneys. We're attorneys in the Midwest or the Rocky Mountain states in 2 or 3 person partnerships that do insurance law, trust and estates. I mean, the legal community in this country is huge and very, very diverse. That's thought number one. Thought number two is, when I was in government as the senior legal official for the Department of Defense, incidentally, Katie, there are something like 12,000 lawyers in the Department of Defense. It's like the largest law firm in the country. From JAGs to civilian lawyers, it's huge. My endeavor, my objective was to always come up with, develop, arrive at the most sustainable, defensible legal position there is. I used to, not just something that is potentially something a judge might agree with, not just, well, here's a legal theory, let's throw it up against the wall and see what sticks. And if we get to the Supreme Court, we've got a 6-3 advantage. That's not the way to approach lawyering if you're in government, particularly if you're in national security or Homeland Security. My objective was to always, as an executive branch lawyer, come up with the most sustainable position. I used to imagine, could I defend this position that I'm about to give the secretary or the president in front of the Senate or House Armed Services Committee and be proud of it? And if I could say yes, then that was my position. Where is the weight of authority? Because so often in thorny issues of national security, the answer is less than clear. And so I believe that should be the objective of every executive branch lawyer in government, advising agency heads, cabinet heads, people in the White House. Thought number 3. Professional responsibility for lawyers in this country is largely a matter that exists at the state level.
Yeah.
When you take the oath of admission, it's administered to you by a state court judge. Professional discipline is a matter for typically state Supreme Courts, not federal courts. So the American Bar Association itself does not discipline lawyers. That's done state by state at the state level. We found in our research that the oath of admission, which exists at state levels, tends to vary somewhat state by state. So we recommended that the oath include a commitment to the rule of law and sustaining our democracy. My recollection is that such an oath exists in one or two places, but in my view, there's no reason why it can't exist in other places. And then the concept of rule of law, commitment to our democracy, is a less than perfectly clear one. It could mean different things to different people. So when you say, well, I'm committed to the rule of law, does that mean therefore that you're committed to the status quo of the rule of law and you're not entitled to in some way test it or seek change? Of course not. So one of the things we recommended in this section on lawyers is for those charged with professional discipline, professional responsibility, to look to see whether there are gaps in those rules that could be filled in to better support and sustain a commitment to the rule of law. We left it to those responsible for professional responsibility to do that.
So I don't have enough time to obviously get through all of the core areas in the report. And again, I urge everybody who's listening to read it because it's incredibly informative and just really kind of gives some insight into how people are thinking across the country, but especially with a focus on democracy. I guess my last question for you would be this, Secretary Johnson, and I'm kind of going to make you Johnny on the spot. On a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being vibrant, healthy, and completely long lasting, your estimation, your grade right now, maybe, of where our norms institutions stand when it comes to the rule of law. I am an eternal optimist, and yet I struggle some days, Secretary Johnson, to think about where we find ourselves.
Well, asking me to put a grade on it is tough. You're talking to somebody who was a perpetual C and D student in high school. So, look, I think that, well, let me answer it this way.
Sure.
For almost the entire history of our Constitution, our American democracy, our democracy has depended not just on the letter of the law, the explicit letter of the Constitution, but also, because there's considerable gray, leaders who are committed to constitutional and legal norms. And when you have someone in office who is not committed to abiding by constitutional and legal norms and continually wants to test the boundaries, push the envelope in court in the hope that you might get the right judge, our democracy is in deep trouble. And so there have been times when we have been tested. I always think about, as examples of this, when Al Gore conceded the election in 2000. Even though in his mind he was convinced he had won the state of Florida and won the presidency, he knew as a constitutional norm that he had to concede to restore order and stability in our democracy. Same thing with Richard Nixon in 1960. Even though Nixon had to resign from office for corruption, Nixon knew in 1960, even though he believed the election was stolen from him, perhaps in Illinois and Texas, that he had to concede. And so a lot of what's in our Constitution is gray. For example, the First Amendment embodies the principles of freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, but it's only 42 words and a semicolon. There's a lot of gray in there that people, for the life of our nation, have respected and adhered to. And so when we have powerful people in office who don't respect those norms, um, our democracy is pushed to the stress point and perhaps even the breaking point. And I fear that's a period we are in right now.
Well, I appreciate your honesty always. This is the type of conversation we have to have. But what I think is the best takeaway from this time spent together is this ABA Task Force for American Democracy, which was a volunteer effort, a Herculean one, seeing how it spanned 2 years in a bipartisan way to be able to achieve these recommendations in these 12 core areas is something that all Americans would benefit reading. And also, I am grateful as well that you, as a patriot, a true patriot, continue to be a part of this process. You have served our country. You continue to serve even in private practice. And I am grateful that you continue to do so. So thank you, Secretary Johnson, for spending your time with me today.
Thank you very much, Katie. Really appreciate it.
Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together.